Hello everyone, this is Dan Miller for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine, and over the course of the last couple months we've been doing a series of videos about improvisation, an approach to improvisation where you're at a jam and you've never heard the song before but you want to take a solo, okay? That's quite a different approach than if you knew the melody but you just wanted to improvise on it or create new variations of it. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what we've been going over is how you might fake it until you make it on a tune that you've never heard before at a jam session, okay? And we said the first rule of thumb, the default, is always just play the notes of the chord. Then we outlined 5 other chords, scales that you could deal with, which was the major pentatonic, the major blues, the major scale, the minor pentatonic, and the minor blues, or what they just call the blues scale. You can use any of those scales, and we also talked about the idea of chord tone targeting, which really helps bring the whatever you're playing, whatever scale you're using, helps sort of bring it together in a more organized way. Now, again, the thing to do is work with all those scales and just get familiar with them, get familiar with the idea of chord tone targeting, and then after you do that, you can, again, when you're soloing, follow the phrasing that you hear in the other soloist or the singer. Follow the contour of the song. Follow the cadence of the song. The phrasing, the contour, the cadence are things that you can pick up pretty quickly. A lot quicker than you can pick up the exact melody. Now again, when you work with this chord tone targeting idea, a lot of times you'll start to get closer and closer to the melody because, again, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of hitting the melody note when those chord changes, and those tend to be the anchor notes of the song. And if you're hitting those in the right places, you're going to sound more and more like the song, even though you don't know the song, okay? Now the other way you can approach improvisation is if you know the melody, and you just want to improvise around it, or you want to create variations of the solo that you already know. Now I did a series about 2 years ago called Learning Music by Ear, and in that series we learned the melody by ear, and then we learned to embellish that melody by using techniques. And the techniques were tremolo and double stops and neighboring notes and cross picking, hammers, pulls, slides, bends. All these technique-based approaches that you can use to create variations around that melody. Again, also the idea of folded scales. If you know folded scales, you can fold any of the 5 scales that we've worked with so far. And I did a video on mandolin about folded scales, but that'll apply to any instrument that you're working with. So if you practice, the idea is if you practice all these things, you practice the approach that we've given over the last 2 months about how to solo on a song that you never heard before, and you also learn how to approach improvisation and arrangement from the technique kind of approach that we talked about before. You integrate those two, what I would call the theoretical approach with the scales and the technique approach with the techniques. You integrate those together, and you've got a lot of great tools to work with when you're creating your own solos or you're improvising. So, you know, famously Duke Ellington called improvisation spontaneous composition. So if you're going from that technique approach where you're learning the melody and then trying to embellish around that melody, and then you get better and better and better at it, and then you can do that in real time, that would, you know, sort of go along with Duke Ellington's quote, is that you're just arranging in real time, and that can be what improvisation is about too. So what I have my students do is work with both approaches and then try to integrate those approaches. Now a third way, I did a book called The Guitar Player's Guide to Developing Creative Solos, and I talked about the technique approach, the theoretical approach, and then I talked about a third approach which I called the intuitive approach. And I have about 14 different exercises in there to develop an intuitive feel for where to go. So you don't have to think about technique, you don't have to think about theory. Those things can inform you, When I interviewed Robert Boland for Flat Picking Guitar Magazine, Robert was a great pianist, plays lots of string instruments, went to school for music, and I said, what do you think about when you improvise? He said, I try to not think about anything, but all those things that I've studied over the years inform what is going on, but I don't have to think about it anymore. So the intuitive approach is a way to play without thinking about what you're playing. You're just playing, okay? But in order to develop that, it takes a lot of practice with other things, whether it's just years and years of playing music that develops that intuitive feel, or whether you use a technique-based approach or a theoretical-based approach. I find that people that start playing at a very young age, somebody for instance like David Greer will tell you he doesn't know much about music theory, but he's a really intuitive player, and he's one of the best guitar players on the planet. But he doesn't rely on the things we've been talking about, because he started playing when he was like 5 years old. He just developed an intuitive feel about where to go. Ideally, that's where you want to be. You want to have whatever music you're hearing in your head spontaneously come out on your instrument. And that just takes a lot of practice. The reason we outline these approaches that we give you is they provide roadmaps. The technique approach, the theoretical approach, provide roadmaps so that you can start to build a foundation which will later ideally lead to this intuitive approach where you're just intuitively playing and you're not thinking about anything. What Charles Sawtelle told me was like a stream of consciousness kind of playing. You know, he said that's what he feels everybody's shooting for. They don't always succeed at that, but ideally that's what you're going for. And I feel, unless you started playing at a very young age and you just started developing an intuitive feel for these things and developed your ear really well early on and your musical memory really well early on, then I think these ideas of technique-based approach that we talked about in the Learning by Ear series and the theoretical-based approach that we've talked about over the last 2 months in the improvisational series, those things can provide roadmaps to help you learn how to get there. It's always nice when you're traveling, if you're not familiar with an area, to look at a map. But once you get familiar with the area, you don't need the map anymore. So ideally, you won't need the theoretical-based approach or the technique-based approach. At some point in time, you will develop an intuition for that. And if you want to, look at some of those exercises that I recommend for people that want to help develop that intuitive approach, again, the book is called The Guitar Player's Guide for Developing Creative Solos. So I'm going to leave you here and end this series on improvisation. For now, maybe we'll dive back into some of these ideas later. But for now, next week we'll move on to something else. I hope you've enjoyed this series on improvisation. And so this is Dan Miller for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.